The lens of a Leica is a cold, unforgiving thing, much like the memory of an old man. I sit here decades later, tracing the ghost of a scar on my thumb, and I try to summon the exact shade of gray that coated the sky over the Belgrade sector in July of 1943. Sometimes I think I remember it perfectly, the way the light died in the thick, suffocating humidity of the Russian steppe. But then I wonder if I am merely editing the film of my past, splicing in darker clouds to suit the mood of the tragedy that followed. That is the curse of my profession, or what used to be my profession. I spent a lifetime arranging the world into rectangular frames, cropping out the messy edges until only the narrative remained. But the edges are where the truth lives. I was huddled in a dugout that smelled of wet wool, stale tobacco, and the bowels of the earth. It was a sensory assault that no photograph could ever capture. The dampness wasn't just in the air. It was in the timber shoring holding up the roof, in the bread we ate, in the marrow of our bones. I had a microfiber cloth, a precious artifact from a life that felt like it belonged to a different species of man. And I was rubbing the front element of my 50mm lens. Circular motions, gentle, precise. It was a ritual of order in a universe that was rapidly dissolving into chaos. If I closed my eyes, I could escape the dugout. I could transport myself back to the office on Kochstrasse in Berlin. God, the smell of that place. It was the sharp, acidic tang of fresh newsprint and the warm, metallic scent of heated typewriter ribbons. I remember the way the light filtered through the high windows, dancing on the dust motes, illuminating the smoke curling from my editor's cigarette. It was a clean world, a world of logic and triumphant geometry. There the war was not mud and dysentery. It was a grand epic being written in real time, and I was one of its authors. I was Klaus Richter, the man who could turn a skirmish into a saga. I believed then, with a fervor that makes my old heart ache with embarrassment, that words could bend reality. I thought that if I described the greater German Reich with enough eloquence, the sheer weight of my adjectives would make it eternal. I opened my eyes. The Berlin office vanished, replaced by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp and the heavy breathing of men who knew they might be dead by sunset. Across from me sat a boy. I cannot recall his name. My notes from that day are long lost, burned or buried, but I remember his hands. They were large peasant hands meant for gripping a plow or a hammer, not the cold steel of a Car 98K. He was trembling. It wasn't a violent shake, but a subtle, high-frequency vibration that traveled up his arms and into his shoulders. He was staring at the dirt floor, his eyes wide and unblinking, looking at nothing and everything all at once. "Ready for the morning?" I asked. My voice sounded hollow, too cheerful, like a radio announcer reading a script in a bomb shelter. The boy looked up. His face was a mask of grease and exhaustion. "They say there are thousands of them," he whispered. "Tanks, mines, miles deep." I pulled out my notebook. The paper was damp, warping at the edges. I uncapped my fountain pen. "It's the decisive blow," I said, adopting the tone I used for my columns. "We have the new tigers, the panthers. It will be a masterstroke of armored warfare. You're part of history, son." I watched him swallow hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He didn't look like history. He looked like a child who wanted his mother. But I didn't write that. I looked at him through the viewfinder of my mind, cropping out the fear, cropping out the trembling hands. I wrote, the ink bleeding slightly into the page. I looked back at him. He was wiping his nose on his sleeve, a gesture of pure, abject misery. "Hold your rifle up," I commanded, lifting the Leica. "Look toward the entrance. Chin up. Look like you see victory coming down the stairs." He obeyed because I wore an officer's uniform and because he was trained to obey. He stiffened his posture. For a fraction of a second, the fear froze into something that could pass for determination. I pressed the shutter release. The mechanism clicked, a soft, mechanical whisper that sounded obscenely loud in the quiet dugout. I had my shot. I had my light. The earth beneath us groaned. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a physical displacement. The timber beams above us groaned in protest, dusting our shoulders with dry clay. Then came the noise. It started as a low rumble, like a subway train approaching a station, but it kept building, layering frequency upon frequency until it wasn't a sound anymore, but a pressure wave pressing against our eardrums. Artillery. The Soviet barrage had begun. It was the overture to the devil's own opera. The boy dropped his rifle. He didn't scream. He just curled inward, making himself small. I grabbed my camera bag, slinging it over my shoulder, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I told myself it was excitement. I told myself this was the scoop, the great crescendo I had been waiting for. But as the dust rained down from the ceiling, coating my tongue with the taste of ancient soil, I knew it wasn't excitement. It was the primal, lizard-brain realization that the ink on my page offered no protection against high explosives. Out, a sergeant roared from the tunnel entrance, his silhouette framed by flashing light. Everyone out. Into the positions, move. I scrambled up the ladder, the Leica banging against my chest. I was climbing out of the womb of the earth and into the furnace. The transition from the dugout to the trench line was a violation of the senses. The pre-dawn light was being strangled by smoke. The air was no longer air. It was a soup of cordite, diesel fumes, and pulverized rock. To my left, the horizon was flickering with a strobe light intensity, a continuous sheet of flashes that signaled the death of the night. I found myself attached to a Panzer Grenadier unit, moving up alongside the heavy armor. This was it, Operation Citadel, the greatest concentration of military power in history, or so the briefing papers had claimed. I raised my camera. I had to document this. That was my purpose. If I stopped documenting, I was just another soft target in a field of fire. I focused on a Tiger tank churning through the mud ahead of us. It was a magnificent beast, a fortress of geometric angles and raw power. Its exhaust spat blue-black smoke, and the ground trembled under its tracks. I snapped the picture. The caption wrote itself in my head. I moved with the infantry, crouching behind the armored skirt of a half-track. My photographic memory, usually my greatest asset, began to overload. I wasn't seeing a narrative anymore. I was seeing fragments. A boot stuck in the mud. A burning tree. The way a soldier's helmet strap dug into his chin. There was no composition here. It was visual anarchy. We pushed forward across a field of tall grass that hissed against our legs. The roar of our own engines was deafening, a cocoon of mechanical noise that made us feel invincible. We were the hammer and the Russians were the anvil. I saw the infantrymen around me shouting, their mouths opening and closing, but I couldn't hear their words over the grinding of gears. They looked like actors in a silent film, their expressions exaggerated and grotesque. Then, the physics of the morning changed. The air above us was torn apart by a sound that I can only describe as the screeching of 1,000 rusted hinges. It was a high-pitched, wailing shriek that scraped against the nerves, the katyushas. The illusions of the Berlin office shattered instantly. The heroic struggle didn't account for the terrifying randomness of rocket artillery. Explosions blossomed around us, not in neat puffs but in ragged, earth-heaving eruptions. The Tiger tank I had photographed seconds ago vanished in a cloud of debris, then re-emerged, its turret traversing frantically. I dove into a shallow crater, pressing my face into the wet earth. The smell of the soil was overpowering, rich and metallic. I looked up, trying to wipe the dirt from my lens. I needed to see. I needed to frame this. If I could frame it, I could control it. To my right, the half-track was providing cover for the squad. I saw the soldier I had shared a cigarette with earlier, a corporal with a scar on his cheek. He was shouting orders, pointing toward a line of trees where the muzzle flashes were sparkling like fireflies. He looked heroic. He looked like the poster. I raised the camera to my eye. I adjusted the focus. The rangefinder patches aligned. The world turned white. There was no sound, only a sudden, absolute vacuum of pressure, followed by a heat so intense it felt like a physical blow. The half-track didn't just explode. It disintegrated. A direct hit. The shockwave lifted me off the ground and threw me backward, my spine colliding with the hard-packed mud of the crater wall. For a moment I existed in a void. No sight, no sound, just a ringing silence that seemed to stretch on for eternity. Slowly the world licked back in. The ringing in my ears was replaced by a dull, underwater roaring. I pushed myself up on trembling arms. My camera was still clutched in my hand, the leather grip slick with something. I looked toward where the half-track had been. It was a burning skeleton, a twisted sculpture of scrap metal belching black, oily smoke. And there, lying in the mud a few meters away, was the corporal. He wasn't shouting orders anymore. He wasn't heroic. He was lying on his back, his arms spread wide as if embracing the sky. His face was untouched, frozen in an expression of mild surprise, but his body ended at the waist. I stared at him. My brain tried to process the image, tried to find a caption, tried to fit it into the story of the greater German Reich. But there were no words. The syntax of propaganda had failed. There was only the mud, the fire, and the dead man staring up at the smoke-choked sun. I lowered the camera. I didn't take the picture. The threshold had been crossed, and I was no longer a spectator. I was prey. The mud wasn't just earth anymore. It was a slurry of gasoline and pulverized history. I scrambled away from the corporal's remains, my boots slipping on the slick clay, moving not by order but by the ancient, animal imperative to survive. The horizon had become a bruise of purple smoke, and the squad I was meant to document had dissolved into the landscape. The cohesion of the Wehrmacht, that iron discipline I had praised in a dozen editorials, had evaporated. I was no longer a correspondent attached to a unit. I was debris in a landslide. I ran until my lungs burned like the air around me, stumbling toward a secondary road that cut through the burning wheat fields, away from the thunder of the Soviet artillery. I expected to find the rear guard, the steel wall of the Reich holding the line. Instead, I found the ghosts. A river of humanity flowed west, a sluggish, silent current of misery that clogged the narrow dirt track. They were not soldiers. They were civilians, German settlers abandoning their stolen farms, Ukrainians caught between two grinding millstones. There were no marching songs here, no rhythmic tramp of jackboots. There was only the creak of wooden cartwheels and the wet, rattling coughs of children. I walked among them, a man in a uniform that symbolized their destruction. Yet I was invisible to them. Grief renders you blind to the details of your tormentors. I saw a horse, its ribs showing like the internal framing of a ship, collapse in the traces. Its owner, an old man with a face like crumpled parchment, didn't weep. He simply unhitched the beast, stepped between the shafts himself, and began to pull. I reached for my notebook, a reflex drilled into me by a decade of journalism. I wanted to describe the scene. I wanted to capture the pathos, the tragedy, the noble suffering. But my hand stopped halfway to my pocket. The words I had spent my life mastering, words like, felt suddenly obscene. They were heavy, useless stones. How could I write about strategic realignment when the reality was this old man harnessing himself to a cart? The syntax of my profession had disintegrated. I had spent years describing the grandeur of the scythe, deliberately ignoring the wheat it severed. I walked on, a writer stripped of his language, witnessing a story I knew I would never be allowed to print. The sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the steppe. The retreating pioneers had done their work well. The scorched earth policy was in full effect. To my left, a farmhouse was being consumed by flames, the thatched roof roaring as it turned to ash. The fire provided the only light in the deepening twilight. And there she was. A woman stood before the inferno. She was not wailing. She was not running. She was statue still, her back to the road, facing the destruction of her world. In her arms, she clutched something tight against her chest. I moved closer, drawn by a morbid voyeurism that I told myself was professional curiosity. She held a porcelain doll. Its face was pristine, painted with a frozen, pink-checked smile, a grotesque counterpoint to the soot-stained face of the woman holding it. It was perfect. It was the absolute antithesis of the propaganda posters. The composition was flawless. The violent orange of the fire, the stoic despair of the woman, the horrifying innocence of the doll. It was the picture of the war. Not the war of maps and generals that I had sold to the German people, but the true war. The war of ash. I raised the Leica. My hands, which had trembled in the crater, were suddenly steady. This was my instinct. This was my eye. I adjusted the aperture, letting in the light of the burning home. But as my finger hovered over the shutter release, a chill went through me that had nothing to do with the Russian winter. To take this photograph was an act of treason. It was defeatism. It was proof that the victory was a lie. If the propaganda ministry saw this, I would be hanged. If the field police patrolling the Reg found this negative on me, I would be shot against the nearest wall. I heard the crunch of boots on gravel behind me. Harsh German voices barked orders to clear the road. A patrol. I should have lowered the camera. I should have turned and saluted, playing the role of the loyal correspondent. Instead, I exhaled. I framed the tragedy. I squeezed the trigger. The shutter clicked, a mechanical guillotine, severing the lie from the truth. I wound the film rapidly, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I didn't take a second shot. One frame, one truth. I slipped the camera under my greatcoat just as the patrol swept past, their flashlights cutting through the smoke. I walked on into the dark, carrying the weight of a treasonous reality in a silver cylinder of film. Decades dissolve like fog. The burning step is gone, replaced by the beige wallpaper of a Munich apartment that smells of dust, old paper, and boiled cabbage. I am old now. The scar on my leg from the shrapnel at Orel has faded to a silver line, but the phantom limb of my conscience still itches in the night. They call me a survivor. They respect my pension. They read my sanitized memoirs about unit cohesion and the camaraderie of the front. They do not know what is in the box under my bed. I sit at my desk, which is no longer a workspace but a museum of silence. My typewriter sits there, a black metal beast that I haven't touched in 20 years. I used to think words were bricks, that I could build a cathedral of national identity if I just stacked them correctly. I was a mason of lies. I built a fortress of adjectives to hide the slaughterhouse. I see the keys, the Q, the W, the A, and I think of them as soldiers standing in formation, waiting for orders that will never come. I cannot write anymore. The ink in my veins has dried up. A writer who cannot tell the truth is like a carpenter without hands, and I cut my own hands off the day I returned from the East. I reach down and pull out the box. It is small, battered cardboard, innocuous. I open it and retrieve the photograph. The paper is yellowing, curling at the edges, but the image is as sharp as the moment the shutter fell. The woman, the fire, the doll. It is a small square of chemicals and light, yet it weighs more than the tanks, more than the artillery, more than the entire ruined Reich. I look at it every day. It is my penance. I wanted to be a chronicler of heroes. I wanted to write the German Iliad, to sing of wrath and glory. Instead, I captured a single frame of the apocalypse. I look at the woman's face, and I see the accusation that has followed me through the economic miracle, through the reconstruction, through the silence of the post-war years. She asks me why I lied. She asks me why I helped build the pyre she burns upon. I see the newspapers today. I see the young journalists with their hungry eyes, looking for the angle, looking to shape the narrative, looking to please the editors and the owners. I want to grab them by the lapels and shake them. I want to show them this foe. I want to scream that you cannot edit reality forever. Eventually, the editor runs out of red ink. Eventually, the story breaks the machine. I am that broken machine. My keys are jammed. My ribbon is torn. All I have left is this image, this proof that once, in the middle of the lie, I opened my eyes. I was a man who wrote the world as he wanted it to be, until the world showed me what it was. This memory is a shard of glass I carry. Help me pull it out. Subscribe to keep this history alive.